Is brewing tonight. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stumping for Trump-backed nominees, and comparisons to former President Trump are in full swing right now. DeSantis taking a very specific stance on abortion, voting laws, and other key issues, all in a way that might attract Trump supporters but not push away more moderate Republicans. News Nation's Joe Khalil live for us in D.C., joining us now with this story. Joe?
Yeah, he's really done a unique job in that way, Natasha. Florida Governor DeSantis, clearly a rising star in the Republican Party and the most likely alternative in GOP voters' minds to Donald Trump as a potential presidential candidate in 2024. He's really built his political brand on towing the line between the establishment Republican Party and what we would call more of the MAGA wing of the party in a way that other Republicans haven't been able to do as effectively, and especially when it comes to these culture wars dividing the country politically. We talked to Republican strategists who say that while a lot of Republicans in the Trump era have embraced these culture war fights, DeSantis really stands out for knowing which fights to fight, using his platform as governor to insert himself into the most high-profile debates, but doing so in a way that stops short of a lot of the extremes on these issues.
He seems to find the sweet spot where there's news coverage of an issue, and he's able to get into that issue and take action. Other candidates, potential candidates, that are not in the spotlight as much as a governor. So he's done a great job of navigating the MAGA world.
So a few concrete examples here of what we're talking about. The 2020 election, supporting, quote, MAGA candidates, and abortion. DeSantis has towed the line on all of these issues. He won't say, for example, the election was rigged or stolen, like many of the more extreme candidates say, but he did champion a new election law in Florida that appeases the Trump voters who do believe the election was stolen. Look, he's now campaigning for and endorsing some of, again, the more far right-wing candidates, but only after they've already won their primaries. And on abortion, he hasn't really expressed support for an all-out ban. He's been relatively quiet about abortion itself, but instead, he has very publicly fired a prosecutor in Florida who vowed not to go after women and doctors who violate the state's abortion restrictions. Now, in our last hour, we actually spoke to that very prosecutor, Andrew Warren, who's now filing a lawsuit against Governor DeSantis over the firing. Warren told us that he felt he was wrongfully fired.
Abortion and transgender health care. The abortion law in Florida was held unconstitutional by the first judge who looked at it, and the transgender health care law doesn't even exist in Florida. So again, this is not about what I've done. This is about what I've said.
Warren saying there that the response was political. We do have a response from Governor DeSantis himself about this lawsuit. He says, quote, "It's not surprising Warren, who was suspended for refusing to follow the law, would file a legally baseless lawsuit challenging his suspension. We look forward to responding in court." Natasha, I should say that coming up this week in Florida, voters are going to go to the polls. And among the races on their ballot, they will also decide which Democrat is going to challenge Ron DeSantis for his governorship in November. Natasha.
All right, Joe Khalil, thank you. And let's take a closer look at the Florida governor's star power. Many are expecting DeSantis to run for president in 2024. And joining us to talk about this hot button topic is Democratic strategist Crystal Knight and host of the radio show Eat, Drink, and Smoke, Tony Katz. Great to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you.
Crystal, thank you, Crystal. I do want to start with you. Governor DeSantis hitting the campaign trail hard for other hard right candidates for the November primaries. His star power is rising. Should Democrats be concerned about a 2024 presidential bid?
Absolutely. I think Ron DeSantis is positioning himself not only to get reelected as governor in a state that is really a swing state, 50-50, meaning Democrat and Republican, but also what he's doing, he's making political gestures that are signaling to the Trump base, to the far right MAGA supporters, that he is the candidate that has a better reputation, a better, election on governing rather than former President Trump. And so we have to remember former President Trump is in trouble right now. Governor DeSantis is not. He's younger, he's healthier, and he's put forth some proposals in his state that many people across the country can identify with. And so I think Democrats absolutely should be worried if he is the Republican nominee, as opposed to Donald Trump.
Well, and Tony, I want to turn it over to you. You know, Governor DeSantis proving to be Donald Trump's main threat in the GOP presidential primary, potentially. Should the former president be worried?
Well, let's go back just a moment. First, Crystal is right. Ron DeSantis is remarkably formidable, and the Democratic Party has absolutely no one who they can put up against him. Zero. They have no bench at all, and that's one of the reasons they're very concerned about Ron DeSantis. But the importance of DeSantis and the reason he is so popular is that he isn't just talking the talk. You talk about all these candidates who want to play in that MAGA world. Ron DeSantis is doing things. He sees parents being attacked for supporting their kids' education. You've got the parental Bill of Rights there. You see Disney deciding to go uber woke. He's having actions about Disney. Whether you agree or disagree, it is about an action being taken. That's what has made him so wildly popular. Is President Trump concerned? I'm not in the inner circle there with President Trump, but I would assume that every Republican who is considering a run for president is aware of the name Ron DeSantis.
Well, and Tony, you know, we're watching him court this base that denies the validity of the election, and he has not weighed in on it publicly himself. How can he continue to do this? Won't he eventually be forced to take a stance here?
I would reject the premise of the question. You think that that's where the political right is in its totality. There are people who object, disagree, don't believe the election. There are people who question certain parts of the election, issues that took place. There are people who are really talking about the problems with mail-in voting and are being very honest and earnest about that. And I think that if you asked Governor DeSantis about that subject, he'd have a lot to say. But what he is doing is about action, and that's what matters. The last thing we need is somebody who talks a big game. These are people who are trying to play a character that they think Donald Trump is. Ron DeSantis is playing the part of governor, of executive, of leader, and that's what's turning people on, and that's why he's getting so much excitement.
Crystal, I want to bring your voice in here because we're certainly see him trying to court this MAGA base, and yet he can't necessarily go all the way because he doesn't want to turn off moderate Republicans. It's a difficult line to tread.
Well, I think it's a difficult line, but he's doing a great job. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation tonight about him is evidence enough of what he's done. Listen, I'm not a Republican, and I don't necessarily agree with much of what the governor has done for the state of Florida, but I do have to agree with the other panelists in that many of the people in the state of Florida and across the country, if you're looking at the polling that you just put up, they agree with his policies. They agree with his get it done attitude. And that's something that many voters across this country identified with Donald Trump. They appreciated that he was aggressive. They appreciate that same tenacity, that same characteristic in a Governor DeSantis. And so when we think about him appealing to moderates, think about him appealing to the far right wing, he's pretty, you know, I think he walks a fine line with signaling and using the language that the Republican base of supporters identify with, but also he's separated himself and shown that he is not a go along with Trump just because he is the leader of the party. He has stood alone and has been able to really differentiate himself. And like he's supporting, you know, these Trump-backed folks post their primary elections, I think that's a smart strategy to signal and to show I support you, but I want to make sure that you're actually going to be in the general election.
Well, Crystal,
let's just be clear. If we could, Glenn Youngkin never mentioned Donald Trump. This has happened before to great success.
Crystal, I do want to mention and bring your opinion in here. I mean, Californians are at least early indicating that they do not want President Biden for another term. Who do you think is likely, meanwhile, on the Democratic side for a presidential nominee?
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, I think Gavin Newsom is likely to, you know, forge into the front. I also think the governor of Illinois is another likely candidate, but we really don't know. I think, you know, we have to leave room for Vice President Kamala Harris. There's much talk about her potentially stepping up, but President Biden has not stated that he will not run. So right now we have to act as if he will absolutely be at the top of the Democratic ticket. And if he is, I expect every single Democrat to fall behind him.
I mean, Tony, if we're looking at Biden on the ticket versus DeSantis, if you're a betting man, what are you looking at?
I'm looking at how many cases of champagne Ron DeSantis is going to order. But the idea, Crystal, I say this to you clearly, the Democratic Party, clearly the party of identity politics. They're going to, in 2024, nominate a white male for president. I'm sorry, I can't see them doing it. I would put my bet on the loser the second time around in the gubernatorial race in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, or possibly in Elizabeth Warren. That's where my money would go.
I think that's a good speculation, but I also think it depends on what happens, this November with Stacey Abrams' race. I'd love to see a woman become president of the United States. I'd love to see another Democratic top ticket candidate as a woman as well. But I think when we're thinking about the landscape comparative to who will the Republicans put up, I think that will be a determining factor in who the Democrats put up.
And Crystal, I do want to give final word to you. If it is DeSantis versus Biden on a ticket, what do you think? Is there a way for Biden to come out on top of that?
Well, listen, I'm a Democrat, so I have to say that I think that, President Biden would win re-election, over the last 2 years, and hopefully over the 4 years, he will be able to put forth a legislative agenda that really will help improve many Americans' lives. And so I tend not to bet against the Democratic Party because I am a Democrat, but I do think that, DeSantis is a great candidate, if I'm being completely honest. And I think it'll be tough, but I think the president has to campaign on what his administration has done over the last 4 years and how specifically Americans' lives have improved under his leadership.
All right, Tony Katz, always great to see you. Crystal Knight, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.